Right. Well, welcome everybody to this month's Hearts for Home Care Monthly Education webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about the basics of government. I think it'll feel very familiar for those of us who have watched that Schoolhouse Rock video. But I think important to talk about the process specific to home care and how we can all best advocate having that knowledge. But I'm going to kick it to my co-host for a few announcements first.
Right. Welcome, everybody. Excited to be joined today and hand off the reins to lead this by my colleague, Kai Yoke. Uh, Thanks for joining this, all Hearts for Home Care advocates. We are excited to have you join this. We will have this call at 7 p.m. If you know of anyone that wants to join later and doesn't want to watch a recording, they'll have a chance to win valuable prizes as well as you right now. As always, all of our calls, we like to give away some swag from Hearts for Home Care. And today we have these Hearts for Home Care trucker hats. I have two of them. The rules are there'll be a lot of ties. So the first answer in the chat wins. This is a bipartisan trivia. The first is here we go. President Joe Biden has a number attached to him. He is the blank number president of the United States. Oh, it's already in there. Congratulations. All
Sean
right.
G.
Excellent. And the second, keeping with the theme of bipartisan, the federal government. Who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives?
I saw it in there.
Then let's scroll back up here.
Justin.
Justin Laley. Right. So we have two winners. I will get your office addresses or where you want it shipped. I will reach out to you via email and get that to you. As always, before I turn it off, I want to let everyone know Hearts for Home Care has a landing page, heartsforhomecare.com. Please go there at any time and visit. There are many resources available for you, a lot of announcements, exciting resources for you to use to be more confident about being an advocate. But with that, I don't want to hold anyone up. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kai Yoke, who is going to take us through an exciting educational session today. Kai?
Cool. All right. As Mike said, I'm Kai Yoke. I'm a senior manager here at Hearts for Home Care, and I work with Mike. And today I'm going to take us through Government 101. It's going to be a lot of me talking. So I do want to encourage folks just throughout today's presentation, put questions in the chat. We're a relatively small group too, so feel free to unmute yourself if you have just specific questions that come up. Want to make sure that everyone gets their questions answered. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to briefly chat about types of advocacy that are relevant to the work that we do at Hearts for Home Care and their importance. We are also going to talk about Government 101, as the name of this webinar implies. We'll get kind of very quickly in the levels and chambers of government, talk broadly speaking about how bills become law, generally speaking, and have some examples, home care specific examples, because we know in the government world, things rarely go the way that you expect them to. So we'll talk about a few specific examples there. And then we'll transition to talking about, having this knowledge, how can we be more effective advocates, or, maybe shed some light on why we strategize the way we do here at Hearts for Home Care. Before we get into it, though, I did want to just briefly introduce Maggie DePasquale to this whole group. It's going to be a pretty busy summer in terms of federal efforts. I know that lots of folks on this call have been seeing our state-specific updates in our newsletters and, of course, our federal updates. But July and August look like they're going to be busy. So I just wanted to give her a second to introduce herself to everyone, and so everyone knew our federal government relations director.
Thank you so much, Kai. As mentioned, I am the Associate Director for the federal side of our Hearts for Home Care team, We are expecting this summer to be pretty busy. I know some state sessions are kind of wrapping down, but summer is a great time for federal session to kind of ramp up. We are expecting a new proposed home health rule to come out of CMS probably at the end of July or end of June, early July. So I'm looking forward to working with everyone here and really advocating for what matters to us. Thank you, Kai.
No problem. And y'all can expect probably sometime in July, we'll host a federal call and kind of get into the nitty gritty of the home health rule and all things that are federal. Because today will be a little bit more general, and that's more 201, 301 level. So stay tuned for more federal info. All right, so let's dive into types of advocacy. So advocacy, generally speaking, is public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. So here at Hearts for Home Care, we get involved in really 3 different types of advocacy. Legislative advocacy, that's going to refer to any type of advocacy that is going to influence the passage of a piece of legislation, or we often refer to legislation as bills. So this would pertain to efforts like the Preserving Access to Home Health Act, which is a piece of legislation which is trying to address this pattern that we have been seeing of cuts to the Medicare home health program. So definitely on the federal level and on the state level as well, we're participating in legislative advocacy. Probably the bread and butter of what we do at Hearts for Home Care is budgetary advocacy. So that's going to include efforts to influence state and federal investments in the respective state and federal budgets. And I think a lot of you are going to be familiar with this because that's going to be any sort of advocacy effort that is trying to increase state Medicaid home care reimbursement rates. So as most of us on this call are aware, state Medicaid programs are, regulated and administered by the state, and they set reimbursement rates for various home care programs. And when we talk about the challenges that we face in home care, obviously don't have to say to this group that our, biggest overarching issue is that these programs are not adequately funded. So a huge part of our efforts here at Hearts for Home Care focus on advocating to our state legislatures and to, state appropriations committees within those legislatures to increase investments in these programs so that we can stabilize access. And then I think another kind of advocacy that doesn't get talked about a lot, but is a very important part of the process is regulatory advocacy. So that's going to include efforts that are either related to influencing the implementation of a law or policy. So that's like, let's say the Preserving Access to Home Health Act, passes the House, it passes the Senate, it's signed by the president. Then it goes into the implementation phase where it really, the kind of X's and O's of a bill really get ironed out. How will this be implemented? What sort of policies need to be in place so that the spirit of the bill that passed is honored? And so a lot can go wrong in that phase. We can have, little policies or things added that really weren't intended for in the bill process. Or, we'll talk later about a piece of legislation in Delaware that passed this session. And the implementation phase is really about making sure that everything goes to plan the way that you would expect. It's also going to pertain to efforts for the Medicare home health program, where we deal significantly with CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So most often we're getting folks, advocates involved in legislative advocacy and budgetary advocacy, and then folks who work in government relations are really focused on the regulatory piece, but we do certainly pull in advocates into that portion as well. One thing I want to say before moving on to this, moving on from this slide though, is when we have new advocates or even new ambassadors who have taken on the volunteer role, something that Mike and I hear a lot is, well, I don't know anything about advocacy or anything about this space, and I'm starting from square one. And one thing I always like to tell folks is obviously the skill set of advocacy, especially for folks who are home care recipients, are direct care workers, you're a nurse, you're a home health aide, maybe you're a client services manager, you work in a home care office. You advocate every single day as part of your work for your clients, for your employees, and becoming an effective advocate is really about translating those skills to a different audience, which is lawmakers. So really just want to say that y'all come in with a lot more skills and a lot more knowledge than you think. And I think the biggest kind of hurdle to getting comfortable is just adjusting to all of the different language that comes with politics and government, and just knowing your audience, which is lawmakers. All right, so let's dive right in. So very basic 101 level, we have 3 levels of government: state, federal, and local. And each of those levels of government have 3 branches: legislative, which is going to be your senators, your House members; executive, which is your president, vice president, governor, lieutenant governor, mayor; and then judicial, which are the courts. So here at Hearts for Home Care, we're really focused on this box right here: state and federal level, and the legislative and executive branches. We're not lawyers. We don't really get involved in the court, so we're not focused on that branch. And the reason why we don't focus on local is because we're really focused on areas of government where policies impacting home care are going to impact the people we serve. So not a lot happens on the local level that is going to impact the administration of state home care programs, federal home care programs. So we spend a majority of our time and efforts and advocacy on the 2 levels that do. So certainly you heard me talk about state Medicaid programs and how much energy we spend making sure programs that are administered through state Medicaid programs are adequately funded. And then, of course, we have a federal Medicare program, which is an insurance program for Americans age 65 plus. A lot happens on the federal level that's not only going to impact, Medicare beneficiaries, but, Medicaid is also a joint federal program. So there's sometimes changes on a federal level to Medicaid that's going to impact every state. So that's where we concentrate our efforts, in this square right here. So this is obviously a lot of words on a slide, but I did want to just kind of do like a brain dump of vocab that as government relations professionals, we use all the time, or that are really important, things that come up all the time. So I just wanted to spend a second before we actually get into, how a bill becomes a law and how that impacts our advocacy efforts of some of these vocab words that you've likely heard in your time advocating. An amendment is going to be any change that is made to a bill, and they can make changes in a variety of ways. They can strike out, insert new language, or do both. We'll talk a little bit more about when amendments are made in the next slide. An appropriation is a sum of money devoted to a special purpose. So really it just means funding. Appropriation is basically the same thing as funding, but you'll often hear committees on a state level call themselves the Appropriations Committee. They're going to be the ones who are building the state's budget and are responsible for increasing the state Medicaid reimbursement rates that we chatted about earlier. Sometimes those committees call themselves finance committees. It's just depending on how the state operates and what they've traditionally called themselves. Caucus is an informal organizations of members of the Senate or the House, or both. There's joint caucuses as well. And really, this is just an informal group where lawmakers can gather to discuss, issues that pertain to that issue. So if there's a home care caucus, as you might have heard that there's one forming in New Jersey, there's also one in Pennsylvania. That's an opportunity for lawmakers to come together, discuss issues that are impacting home care, talk about possible policy priorities, such as funding, home care reimbursement rates. They might identify some areas where research needs to be done, but really it's just kind of like an informal group where lawmakers can meet together, discuss an issue, and make a plan of attack, so to speak. Resolution is one that you're going to hear a lot. It's an official expression of the opinion of the will of a legislative body. So this is something that happens in state and federal legislatures every single day. If you've ever gone to a state advocacy day and you've kind of been in the gallery and it's recognized as Home Care Advocacy Day, that would be submitted through a resolution. Sometimes they might honor someone who has recently passed away or honor someone in the community who has done something exceptional. But you can also get official matters completed through resolutions as well. So it's kind of like the difference really is that a law is like a binding piece of policy, and a resolution is a little bit more informal. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. An omnibus bill is one that you've likely heard a lot on the federal level. It's a large bill that is generally made up of numerous smaller bills on the same broad topic. Sometimes our federal lawmakers are better at sometimes than other at making them the same broad topic. But this is a very common tactic that is used on the federal level, especially in the second year of Congress. You know, we have elections later this year, and there'll be a new Congress next year. So it's really a tactic they use as they're wrapping up sessions, trying to get a lot of efforts across the finish line before session ends. And again, that will come up again later. Companion bill is an important one because this is something that happens in our federal government and in some state legislatures where you basically have a piece of legislation introduced in both houses at the same time. And they are usually similar or identical pieces of legislation. Conference committee, that's one you'll hear a lot today as well. That's going to be it's an ad hoc panel of Senate and House members who are called conferees. And these are formed whenever there is differences between what is passed in the House and the Senate. So that you choose representatives from both chamber to come together and resolve the differences. Continuing resolution. This is also one you're going to hear a lot in the federal government. This is a joint resolution that is enacted by Congress. This basically comes up near the end of the year when the government is trying to pass their federal budget. They're supposed to do so by October 1st. And as we've known from recent years, they are seldom meeting that deadline on time. So they have to pass something called a continuing resolution. It's called a CR, which will basically fund the government in the meantime while they work to pass the actual budget. So if you ever hear about like a looming shutdown, it's because the government has not done its duty to pass a budget. And if they don't pass a budget and they can't also kind of come together to pass a CR to fund the government in the meantime, that's when the government shuts down. All right, then we have markup. This is used on the federal level, but the process also happens on the state level as well. Some state legislatures just don't call it a markup officially, but this process does happen on both the state and federal level. It's really just when congressional or state committees or subcommittees debate and make any changes to bills in the committee stage. You'll see that when we chat on our next slide. Line item veto. This is a thing that's come up on the state level a few times, so I wanted to make sure I introduced it here. It's basically a veto just of a specific line of a piece of legislation, usually an Appropriations Act. So in some states, when a budget is passed, it gets to the governor, and in some states, not all, the governor has the ability to line item veto, which is just strike a specific part of the budget. In other states, they don't have that veto power, and it's basically an all or nothing veto. That was a lot, and we're going to kind of dig right into how a bill becomes a law after this. So I do want to just like stop for just a second and see if folks have any other like vocab questions that have come up, or, you know, conversations with lobbyists in your state where you've had, you know, a word come up and you're not quite sure what that word is or what the process is. And don't be shy. Even as government relations professionals, we are sometimes Googling on the side to figure out what a state-specific priority might mean.
Did well, no questions.
Perfect.
Super overview is the comment.
Also, yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. All right, let's dive into how a bill becomes a law. So this graphic that we made really is just the general process by which bills can become a law. This is going to be a theme throughout today's presentation, but really each state government especially has its own rules and processes. Each state government has its own legislative calendar, how many months a year they're in session, the requirements that a bill has to have when it's filed. It gets obviously very nitty-gritty, and each state has their own processes. And of course, the federal government has their own processes and their own kind of ins and outs and how this process differs. But this is the overarching process by which state and federal governments generally pass legislation. we'll talk a little bit about kind of where things can go wrong and how we can readjust in just a bit. In general, though, this is the process, and a bill must be approved by both chambers and the executive branch, unless the legislative branch can override the president or the governor's veto, depending on whether it's state or federal. Generally speaking, to have it's called a supermajority. That's a supermajority is when you have the votes to override a governor's veto. So in the state of North Carolina, this is something that's come up a lot. You have a Democratic governor and a Republican House and Senate, and they have kind of throughout the years been just shy or just over a supermajority where they can actually override the governor's veto. But let's just get into the process itself. So actually, before we even start, before a bill is even introduced, there's a lot of work that has to happen before to even get into this process. So at first, there has to be an idea, right? This is where, us as government relations professionals here at Hearts for Home Care really rely on meeting with all of you, meeting with home care recipients, with nurses, with home health aides, with home care professionals to really get a sense of what are the challenges that you're facing, either accessing care or delivering care. What are the problems that we need to solve? It's really these discussions with all of you that we can then go to our lawmakers and say, hey, we are declining 60% of referrals. We can't get a home health aide to stay. This is the cost of onboarding. We really need increased funding to be able to meaningfully recruit. Or, another issue, a big issue that we face in home care is the lack of quality data. So this, we'll talk about a Delaware effort as an example, but, that effort really started because we were talking with, office staff and with lawmakers who were actually wanting better data to, prove the need for more funding. So it's really those conversations where we figure out what we need to prioritize and what we need to tackle in a legislative session. So really those types of conversations are going to be happening off session, as we say. So we do have a resource that kind of says, when each state is in session that I'm happy to include in our materials after this call. But that would be our time to really meet with all of you and try to figure out, what is a priority to be worked on through session. Then you have to find a lawmaker who is willing to put their name on the bill and to really be the leader who can, convince fellow committee members and also fellow, House members or Senate members to support this bill. After you've found a lawmaker to kind of champion the bill, that's when a bill would be introduced when session begins. As soon as a bill is introduced, that's sometimes called the first reading, and usually bills have 2 or 3 readings throughout the process. As soon as it's introduced, it's going to be referred to its relevant committee. So a lot of our issues in general get referred to, health committees, which would not be shocking to anyone. Sometimes to health appropriations subcommittees. There's sometimes subcommittees, certainly on the federal level, and many states have subcommittees as well. Sometimes you might have a bill that actually needs to go to 2 committees because of the issues that it touches on. But in general, it's going to have to go to a committee first before it gets voted on in the full chamber. During committee, there can be amendments added to a bill. There can be parts of a bill struck out. That's where what we'd refer to as committee markup. If the bill passes, it would be sent to the full chamber for a vote. If it doesn't pass, that's where the process ends right here. After the bill goes to the full chamber, it is debated and voted on. Some states actually have mechanisms where they can add amendments on the House floor. Some states you can't. Again, that's going to be just specific procedural things. After the bill passes, it's going to go to the other chamber for consideration. And again, as it did over here, it's going to immediately be sent to a relevant committee. Then the same process happens. It's going to be sent to the full chamber for a vote. And this is the step that we talked about on the last slide of conference committees. A lot of times there are changes that are made in committee. If you know, the bill is passed here, but the Senate decides to make a change, or here, sorry. If they make a change in this committee, you know, that's technically a different bill than the House voted on. So it's going to have to then get sent to a conference committee where those differences are ironed out, and it then has to be sent back. This actually has like a step missing, but the conference committee will solve the differences, and because it's technically a different bill than each chamber has voted on, they both have to revote, and then it goes to the executive branch, either for signature or veto. And then many states have laws that a law can become effective after a certain number of days if the governor doesn't choose to sign or veto it. So we often see that where, you know, a governor doesn't really agree with what's been passed, but you know, maybe there's a super majority and he knows that his veto is going to get overridden, or that it would, you know, make too much noise for him to make that sort of veto, but doesn't want to put his or her signature to that piece of policy. So they'll just kind of let it passively become law. And after that, that's what we talked about. That's when the regulatory phase really begins, and we do a lot of effort to make sure that laws are actually implemented in the spirit in which was intended for in the bill. And that takes a lot of work. I know that's not, so I'm actually gonna, before we open up for questions there, I am just gonna talk about this example in Delaware. We've been calling the data transparency bill. So as we said before, this really started as an effort between government relations professionals and home care operations and lawmakers who really identified we just don't have good data to articulate the need for more funding and kind of the scope of services that folks even get. And the quality of data definitely differs wildly by state. This is an effort in Delaware. It would create a duty for the division to provide an annual report that documents the use of specific home care services, and would require that an independent third-party organization that would create that annual report to give to lawmakers to really help inform them on the magnitude of home care utilization and help articulate the need for increased funding. So this bill actually hit a barrier pretty early in the process. So the bill passed the Senate Health Committee unanimously after it was introduced, but it hit a barrier when its fiscal note, which is how much a bill costs, triggered its referral to a second committee, the Senate Finance Committee. And for a few reasons, it wasn't expected to pass that committee. So as soon as it had that kind of fiscal note attached to it, it kind of became a budget item, and we knew that this was not going to be a priority for the members of this committee, and it was likely to just stall there. So if we're looking at this process, we did all this kind of pre-work, the bill was introduced, the bill went to committee where it passed unanimously, but then instead of being sent to the chamber for the full vote, it was referred to a second committee where we weren't expecting it to move. So instead of just letting that piece of legislation die, which is kind of how we refer to our legislation when it doesn't move anymore, our Hearts for Home Care director, Rob Lattin, worked with our partners at the Delaware Home Care Association and with lawmakers who are the primary sponsors of this bill, which you can see in kind of tiny text over here, to say, how can we still make meaningful steps towards getting quality data this session, even if this bill is not going to cross the finish line. So you see that we adapted and we found a way. And the way that we did this is kind of more 201 level, 301 level, is to turn the effort from a bill into a resolution. So we talked about earlier, a resolution is a tactic that state and federal legislatures use all the time. And really the difference in this case was that instead of it being the bill, if it passed, would have mandated that this annual report be created every single year from now until another law is passed saying that they don't have to do that anymore. This resolution is different in that it's funding a one-time report. And instead of being funded with state dollars, it's going to be funded with American Rescue Plan Act funding, which many states got, big pots of money in the wake of the pandemic, to address workforce issues and to fund items like this. Um, and instead of it kind of being every year here on out, it's going to be a one-time report that looks at the last 5 years of data. So obviously, there's still a need moving forward, to ensure that we're getting quality data on an annual basis. But this was just one way, to pivot in the process to make sure that we're still making meaningful progress this year. And also that report that looks back 5 years is obviously going to be helpful in next session and sessions to come to say, here's kind of where we're trending, but it's also going to be a helpful extra tool in getting that bill across the line in future sessions to really say, hey, this is great data. It's really giving transparency into what home care providers and home care recipients are facing. And this is why we need a recurring annual report. Any questions before we move on to talking about state, or not state, but state and federal budget processes?
Yeah, before you jump in, really quickly, a great high-level example of this is I see Jill Middleton and Rachel Cobble and others that I've walked the halls with my other colleagues at Hearts for Home Care for lobby days, and you're advocating and meeting with legislators, and we always have fact sheets with us, and we always ask you, the advocates joining this, to make sure you tell your personal stories, to supplement the asks on those sheets. Those asks are quite difficult to put together the fact sheets because we can't have conversations with other home care companies to find out what they charge, that's highly illegal. So we have to go off what we rationalize as numbers. This is going to make it so much cleaner and clearer when we're communicating with legislators, taking the burden off of you, the advocates, when you're working with legislators, making it so much easier to just focus on the stories, the personal stories that we always ask you to add to these meetings. And we will be able to leave this relevant document that can't be questions because it's coming from an independent party that we cannot take credit for. We could say, nope, this was provided to everyone. These are the facts, and we could just go on with our stories and how they relate to us and our pain points for our clients, their families, and the caregivers that you're working with.
Thanks, Mike. And congrats to Delaware Advocates on being a part of that. All right, let's talk about budget processes now. Honestly, they're similar to how a bill is passed, but it is a distinct process. Again, I'll start with my disclaimer to say every state does things differently. So this is just a general overview, and this specific graphic deals with the federal budget process specifically. So we'll start there and kind of talk about more about the kind of intricacies. But let's just go through this graphic together. So how it starts on the federal level is that federal agencies will submit budgets for the executive branch, the president, vice president, his cabinet to review. And really the first step, that's kind of step before the step. I think when we think about budget processes in general, we think of the kind of the first step as being the executive branch creating and releasing their budget. So the president will submit a budget request to Congress. This happens on the state level as well. In the beginning of legislative sessions, usually the governor will outline his or her priorities for the year and will give a sense of, obviously a funding levels at which that governor thinks the program should be funded. What is kind of interesting, and I think folks may not realize this, is that those executive budgets aren't necessarily binding documents. And it'll definitely differ state by state how much the governor's budget actually influences the final budget. So you have states, I already mentioned, like North Carolina, where you have big party differences between who's the governor and who are, appropriations leadership. So when you do have, those leadership differences, obviously a Democratic governor is going to have different priorities than a Republican appropriations leadership. So what's in a governor's budget is not necessarily what is going to end up on the finish line, so to speak. And the same is true of the president's budget request to Congress. After the president submits his budget request or the governor submits his budget, it's then up to the legislative branch to begin their work on the budget. So you're going to have, as we mentioned before, appropriations committees, maybe called finance committees, who are going to begin their work on the budget and start setting out their priorities. So this is specific to the federal process, but the House and the Senate will set their budget resolutions, which will just set spending levels, which will basically give guidance to these 12 House and 12 Senate appropriations committees. Basically, here's your target number, here's how much money you have to work with. That doesn't always happen on the state level, but what is going to happen with both is that appropriations committees in both chambers, the House and the Senate, are going to work on budgets on a subcommittee. Those subcommittees will present their recommendations, will roll up to full appropriations committees. They'll take a vote, and then that'll roll up to the whole chamber. So they'll have kind of two markup phases, usually on the subcommittee, then on the full committee, and then it's sent to the full chamber. Something you'll notice about the federal budget process, and this is also true of how bills become a law on the federal level, is that they're both doing this work at the same time. Sometimes in state legislatures, and again, this will be decided by the state constitution, sometimes it'll start in the House. So like in Georgia, it says in their constitution, the budget process begins in the House. Their subcommittee will, do their markup and vote. It'll go to the full committee, and then it'll go to the chamber, and then it goes to the Senate. That's not true at the federal level. They're kind of both doing it at the same times, which means there'll always be a conference committee. Some states will do it the way Georgia does it. Some states will do it the way the federal government does it with companion bills. We're using our vocab lesson today. But in general, I don't want to speak too generally, but I think when it comes to state budgets, we almost always see a conference committee. There's always going to be some sort of changes or differences between what the House wants and what the Senate wants. They're all vying for their specific priorities. So typically at the end of a budget season, for a lot of states, that's going to be June, mid to late June. It's going to be the conference committees, those leaders from each chamber coming together to iron out the differences and then send the budget to the governor. And as with any law, the president then will have to veto or sign the budget to make it effective. Any questions here? We'll talk about South Carolina as a specific example, but I know most of the work that we do is budget work, so I want to make sure I give folks the time to ask any questions.
All right, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, again, this is a little wordy, but the same thing with bills that we had talked about is the work is happening before session begins. So this is South Carolina as an example. South Carolina's 2024 legislative session began in January of 2024, but the work on the state budget began, long before session even began. So, us as Hearts for Home Care lobbyists and government relations professionals, we're really spending late summer and early fall meeting with state agency directors, with folks in the governor's office to try to get to them early, because we know that come October, November, they're really already having a good sense of what is going to be in the executive budget. So you can see that in October of 2023, the South Carolina Department of Health and Human Services submitted their budget request to the governor's office, which meant Melissa Ullman, who's our director of government relations in South Carolina, was meeting with state agency heads and with the governor's office in really August and September to get in their ear and make sure that home care was represented. I'm happy to say that home care priorities were included in this session's agency budget request, which always makes things easier when it's easier to ask to stay included than to ask kind of each step of the process. Hey, the the governor left us out of his budget. Can you put us in? The House left us out of the budget. Can you put us in? Always a much easier ask to say, hey, keep us in the budget. So after the state agencies submitted their request to the governor's office, really the healthcare subcommittees on the legislative side really already began meeting to discuss the general priorities for session for the year. January, as expected, the governor released his version of the 2024-2025 budget. Then typically what happens is the state agency heads will then present what their budget requests were in front of the legislature. So that's going to happen in both chambers. You see the Medicaid director presented his budget to the House Ways and Means Committee in February, and in South Carolina, House Ways and Means are the appropriators. They just call themselves a different name. Then in March of 2024, so February 2024, when the Medicaid director presented his budget, this is just called a hearing. So there wasn't any sort of markup or changes made to the budget, but just an opportunity for the state agency to say, here's what I think this program needs. Then in March 2024, there was the committee markup. So the Appropriations or House Ways and Means Committee met to present their recommendations, passed out of subcommittee, and then it was presented to the full committee for a vote. It's really not uncommon for the subcommittee vote and the full committee vote to be happening 24 hours or even less apart, because if it passes subcommittee, it's often going to pass the full committee. Also in March of 2024, it headed to the full House floor for a vote where it passed out of the House. Then the budget was on the Senate side, so the Medicaid director presented the same presentation to the Senate Finance Committee, the Healthcare Committee. Again, they are the appropriators, but they call themselves the Senate Finance Committee. Same process. The chairs of the Healthcare Finance Committee presented the full request in front of the full committee for a vote, and then it headed to the House floor, where it passed out of the Senate. So in this case, there were differences, as we routinely see between the House budget and the Senate budget, not for home care though, that the amount of funding was the same in both. So we're not, expecting any major changes to be made on our behalf, but the committee can technically make any changes to the budget during this conference process. Once they've finished their work of resolving the differences, it will be sent back to the House and the Senate for a final vote, where it will then head to the governor's desk. It will have an effective date of July 1, 2024. That's kind of a classic example, nothing really, as in the Delaware case, nothing that kind of was unexpected. And the budget process does, in general, have a kind of stricter process, although I'll say they don't always pass a budget when they say they do, or when they say they will. Right. Any questions before we kind of tie things into advocacy? Keep going.
You're good.
Some takeaways from today's presentation. So, whether it's in the passage of a bill or the budget process, it's really important that we engage all of the key decision makers. So that's going to be, of course, the executive branch, state agencies, both the House and the Senate, and regulators in order to successfully pass and implement a home care policy. So really can't afford to miss any steps along the way. We want to make sure that obviously, leaders in the governor's office and the lawmakers are supportive of what we do, but also that folks in state agencies, regulators who help actually implement these laws and these budget requests understand what we're trying to do and are supportive of what we do. As you saw from those graphics, really committee work is a huge part of the legislative process. And it's really important that we really hone in on those lawmakers who sit on committees that are going to be regularly dealing with the issues that impact access to home care. So we spend a lot of time cultivating support among chairs and vice chairs of those committees. But it's also important to know that, who's on what committee and who's even a leader of a committee, those things are changing all the time. So even though we do hone in on these committees, it's really important that we are also kind of doing these blanket grassroots efforts, building up general knowledge of home care among an entire legislature, because you never know who is in one session or two session going to suddenly be sitting on a committee that's really important. So I'll just say that too. We're going to talk about some tools that you can learn a little bit more about your lawmakers, but don't be, discouraged if you're looking up your lawmakers and you're like, oh, they don't even sit on a healthcare committee. They're not on an appropriations committee. It's still going to be really important that we educate them, not only so they can just better serve their constituents, because they're most certainly going to have constituents who are impacted by a lack of access to care. But we also never know when suddenly that lawmaker is going to be a key decision maker for us. I think another important thing to emphasize with this is that in our work, timing really is everything. We craft our entire advocacy strategy based on who has the power, when they have the power to do so. So at each of those stages, when a particular piece of policy is in committee, you'll maybe see an action alert that's targeted toward that committee, or you might get an email from your state partner or Mike or myself that's like, hey, you're actually a constituent of the appropriations chair. Could you give him his office a quick call? Would you join us in a meeting? I think thinking about the timing of when a certain committee might hear a specific bill, lawmakers really connect with advocates who are paying attention in that way, and with advocates who take the time to know what committees they're on, what issues they're passionate about, and that can really be the difference in an effective legislative meeting and a meeting that doesn't quite leave an impression on a lawmaker. I kind of chuckled when I was writing this last one, because advocacy really is a marathon, but it's also a sprint. So I think you can look at just this state budget example, right? Like, look how much happened in just late February, March. You spend months preparing and kind of building support, and then things happen fairly quickly. So I think as an advocate, knowing there's things you can kind of do in the off session that are really that relationship building tactics, inviting a lawmaker to your office, showing them what you do every day, inviting them to a home visit, giving them an eye for what does home care actually look like. So when you get to those moments where we're really time sensitive, and a committee head might be hearing from a lot of lawmakers, they remember who you are, they remember the impact that you made on them in that effort, and will make them more likely to prioritize us in that moment. It's also just a plug for, if you see an action alert come through your inbox, take action on it quickly. Those things are often not live for very long and are sent because, hey, we only have a few days or a week to really get this priority across the finish line, or we have a specific need to make as much noise as possible in that moment. So I think is a good first tool in kind of putting this knowledge into action is to just learn more about your lawmakers. So on our website, under the Get Involved page, you'll see a Learn About Your Lawmakers tool. If you've already taken action with us before, that should automatically populate. And if not, you have to just enter your address and some information. And it will look like this. So I live in New York, so I've got my New York lawmakers popping up. When I type in my address, these are my state and federal lawmakers who represent me. And this is just a screenshot, but all I have to do is then click on that lawmaker, and it's going to give me some really helpful background. How many terms has my senator served in Congress? It'll give you some information about their last election, and then information on bills they work on the most. So what I would look at when I come here is what committees does my lawmaker sit on? And I can see here she's a member of the Aging, Armed Services, Agriculture, and Intelligence. So of course my interest is piqued immediately with Aging. I really could reach out to her office and say, I see she's a member on the Aging Committee. I work with advocates who are really passionate about access to Medicare home health. We'd love to chat with you all and get her support for adequately funding Medicare home health. Find those connections really easily. And even if she wasn't on the Aging Committee, I'd say, I work in home care. I really want to make sure that she's aware of the work we're doing to serve her constituents. Also have information like contact information, social media, which I definitely recommend following your lawmakers on social media or subscribing to their newsletters to kind of keep up to date on events they're having in their community. I'm thinking of our ambassador, Betsy Brown, who is actually attending a community event right now with her representative, Rep. Cisco Monty, and she sent us an email just before this saying she got 45 seconds with him, and in that 45 seconds, got him to agree to a home visit. So those community events are definitely a good thing to keep apprised of, and following them on social is going to be your best bet, finding out when those are.
Hi, Betsy actually just emailed us back that she went back and got a picture too. She got a selfie.
Awesome. Love that. We're like, way to make use of your 45 seconds. This is
Hey,
after-
I'm done with the meeting. I just wanted to share the Chamber of Commerce is always a great
Yes.
place to be a member of because they usually are a big part of the events that happen with lawmakers.
Perfect. I can't believe you hopped on this call after, Betsy. You're having a productive day.
You know what? I was so excited because I did get to meet with them afterwards too. So,
Nice. Perfect.
and got a quick interview with the local news. So, yeah, I've been a little busy this morning.
Nice. Well, congrats, Betsy. Great work. Great. Well, this is the advocacy menu. I really share this on a lot of our trainings just to give folks like an idea of all the different things you can be doing. I really want to share this slide to say, when you folks have time, kind of go back and look at, the budget process and the legislative process and think about, all the tactics that can be utilized and when. So I've already shared, in general, we're going to be sending action alerts that make sense given where a policy is, kind of in the process. But you might see, requests from us to write a personalized note or to make a phone call when it's really time sensitive to get a particular item across the finish line. And then I'll just make another plug, we've already said that's probably going to be quite a busy summer on the federal side. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to request a meeting with your federal lawmakers. Keep an eye on their community events. But even as state sessions wrap up their budget cycles, the summer and the fall is going to be a really great time to think about doing home visits with your lawmakers, really start building that off-session support so that when we get back in session and our priorities start moving quickly, we already have them on board and have their support. And then I'll just make one plug. June 18th is going to be a really fun program that we're going to have. I'm going to invite a small handful of home care recipients and advocates and professionals kind of to share their story and to share their experience of advocating and really have it be just a peer-led call where advocates can pick fellow advocates' brains. So I hope you all can join for that. And yeah, I think these two are things these last few items are items I've already said, but I'll also just say if you're interested in putting together a home visit or you want to invite a lawmaker to your office, reach out to us. We can kind of give you the tips to get started with that. I always like just to finish with a picture of me and Mike, just in case anyone new joins. And because I love this picture of me and Mike. I know
Always
it's taken
swag.
most of our time today. Does anyone have questions before we break for the day? Not a chatty group today, but that is okay. I think sometimes government 101, you got to let it sit for a second.
It was heavy. It was heavy.
Not the sexiest of topics, but it's important. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday and fun summer, and we'll see you next month.
Have a great one, everybody.
Thank you.